floor over to Lev Cates, our past president, and also a former student of Rabbi Polak's, to do the formal introduction. I thank Randy Cohn and Devorah Sorsher for helping to make sure that this program has taken place this year and for so many years as well. Lev?
Thank you, Rabbi Matanki, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening as well. Rabbi Joseph Polak was born in Nazi-occupied The Hague, Netherlands in 1942. He and his mother survived the Westerbork and the Bergen-Belsen concentration camps. His father died in the days after the end of the war of typhus and malnutrition. When he had just turned 6, he and his mother moved to Canada, where the nightmarish presence of the war years never quite left them. Rabbi Polak, who is best known for his 46 years of service as a campus minister at Ohio and Boston universities, is currently a writer and scholar and serves as a chief dayan of the Rabbinical Court of Massachusetts. He writes about Jewish law, about Nazi medicine and medical ethics as an associate professor of health law at the Boston University School of Public Health. His articles have appeared in Commentary, Tradition, Surgery, and The Lancet. His memoir, After the Holocaust, The Bells Still Ring, won a National Jewish Book Award and continues to be widely read in college and high school courses on their literature of the Holocaust. A Hebrew translation of the book is forthcoming from Yad Vashem. Rabbi Polak and his wife live in Brookline. Their children and 20 grandchildren live in the US and Israel. On a more personal note, I met Rabbi Polak while I was a student at Boston University. While at BU, I had the benefit of learning with and becoming very close with Rabbi Polak. It is due in no small measure to Rabbi Polak's influence on my life that shaped where I am today as a Jew. From the classes that he taught to lectures that he facilitated, Rabbi Polak is a force that is incredible to watch and be a part of. Rabbi, I've missed joining you for the Yamim Noraim davenings, building the Hillel Hillel House Sukkah, being part of the BU Hillel House board meetings and going to your classes. I want to personally thank you for all that you've done for me personally and for my family. And without further ado, Rabbi Polak.
Thank you, Lev. Thank you, Rabbi Matansky. Thank you for all of you for having me here tonight. I'm going to talk for a while and then take questions. Feel free to ask any questions that you want, but hold them to the end. Maybe mark them down as I'm talking. There were, I want to say, 1.5 million children that were murdered in the Holocaust. These are the people that I speak for. These are the people that I memorialize, and I will be speaking about them through my own experience for the rest of the evening. The number 1.5 million children is impossible to think about, to imagine, simply too large. The number of children who were in orphanages in the Warsaw Ghetto numbered 100,000. Think about that. The people who died first in the Holocaust, either through direct murder or through hunger, were the children. All those photographs that you see of children begging in the Warsaw Ghetto are very early photographs. Later on in the ghetto, a year or two in, there were very few children left. So tonight, we speak about them. I'm born in Holland, as Lev said. I'm born in Holland in 1942, and Holland, at the time of my birth, had 135,000 Jews living there. At the end of the war, 1945, Holland had less than 35,000 Jews left, many of whom were in hiding, many of whom escaped, many of whom lost their families. The shul that I davened in, the shul that my grandfather was the chazan at, used to be full every Shabbos. After the war, 20, 30 people came. And what drove people mad at the end of the war was that you understood that it wasn't a long weekend. It was a long forever, because all those Jews that were no longer there had been murdered, and no one could live with that. And another 10,000 Jews left Holland after that. But I don't want to spend my whole time talking about Holland. I want to begin with our family being collected in late 1943 and brought to the weirdest place on earth, and that is a concentration camp, a transit camp in northern Holland called Westerbork. Westerbork goes down into history as the weirdest of all of the concentration camps. Why? Westerbork had barracks, but it had plenty of food. Westerbork had a soccer team. Westerbork had a hair salon. Westerbork had a cabaret. Westerbork gave the impression that the Nazis would take care of you. So you came with your people to Westerbork, and you came into a room with a table, 25 typewriters, and your name was typed onto the typewriter. And as soon as that name was typed on a card in the typewriter, that was your ticket to death. All those people, with few exceptions, were murdered. Those cards still exist today. They were found in the last 3 or 4 years in Holland. And I was able to trace some of my family members and certify certain dates that I wasn't sure about by looking at those cards. Westerbork had a hospital that had 1,000 beds with every conceivable medical specialty of the day. The doctors gave academic papers. They had conferences, and the doctor, Dr. Spanier, who was in charge of the hospital, if he kept you in the hospital, you hoped the longer the better, because that means that you didn't ever leave Westerbork. Every Tuesday morning in Westerbork, punctually at 11 a.m., a train left Westerbork. The train went either to Auschwitz or to Sobibor or to Theresienstadt or to Bergen-Belsen. Nobody in Westerbork knew where the trains were going, or if they did not know what those places were. What you were told is that when you get on the train, it will take you to a labor camp where you will be working and where the conditions will be at least as good as they are in Westerbork. So what happens is that on Tuesday morning at 11 a.m., the train is there. On Monday night, a guy with a clipboard comes into your barracks and he calls off the names. And those names are among the 2,500 people that board the train, mostly passenger trains, though not always, that take you to one of those 4 places. Eventually, as the war moves along, all of a sudden, the orphanage in Amsterdam is emptied and brought to Westerbork, and all the old people from the Moshavei Skeinim are brought to Westerbork, and you start to say, wait a minute, they're going to labor camps? They can't even walk. Westerbork is filled with lawyers, it's filled with judges, it's filled with businessmen. There was a judge there from the Dutch Supreme Court who was a prisoner in Westerbork. And people couldn't figure it out. The most fundamental question that you asked when you came to Westerbork is, what in God's name am I doing here? Or as the old people put it, what did I do to deserve this? One lady was famous for saying, I washed my sidewalk in front of my house every single day. Why did they bring me to Westerbork? Now, Westerbork was a palace compared to the rest of the Holocaust. And they were purposely trying to fool you, to teach you that the Nazis take care of their people, you will be well taken care of. And that meant that every Tuesday morning, 2,500 people were put on yet another train to one of those places, and they were put on it for the most part very peacefully, very calmly, because you're going to an okay place until the war is over. And of course, that's not exactly what happened. The image that one needs to have of Westerbork is of the trains, the dreaded trains. And I will return to the subject of trains a little later. On on February 1st, 1944, my mother, my father, and I are taken on a train from Westerbork to Bergen-Belsen. Now, one needs to understand Bergen-Belsen. Bergen-Belsen is not yet the place that you and I now know about. And I'm an only child. I'm with my parents. And it's kind of okay. And it's also important to remember that I'm a little bit more than 1 year old, and I have no memories of this whatsoever, certainly not any cerebral technicolor memories. Bergen-Belsen begins as a very interesting camp. It had a nickname in Holocaust humor. It was called the Hilton. Prisoners that were taken, the Jewish prisoners that were taken to Bergen-Belsen, were the people with the best passports, with the best connections, with the best possible defense of their lives. And in particular, because they were taken to Bergen-Belsen, because they would prove after the war to be very lucrative for prisoner exchange after the war, right? There are all kinds of German prisoners of war that the Americans have, the French have, everybody has prisoners of war. Germany wants its people back. It will trade prisoners of war towards the end of the war. And Bergen-Belsen was made up of these people. So you figure you had a chance to live. Bergen-Belsen had food. Bergen-Belsen had drinking water. Bergen-Belsen, in the Pesach of 1944, Bergen-Belsen baked matzah for the prisoners. The prisoners in Bergen-Belsen wore their own clothes. They did not wear prison garb. And if they wore their own clothes, that means that still affixed to their clothes was the Jewish star, the yellow star. And that's why the Jewish camp in Bergen-Belsen, there were also Russian prisoners there and others, but the Jewish camp in Bergen-Belsen was known as the Sternlager, the star camp, because everybody had stars on their clothing. The Sternlager had about 9,000 people in it. And it is out of the Sternlager that the Hungarian Jew Kastner made a deal with the Germans, with Eichmann, and liberated 200 Jews from Bergen-Belsen, took them by train and brought them to safety, believe it or not. And that group included the late, great Rav Yoel Teitelbaum, Rabbi Yoelish, the Satmar Rebbe. And everything is going, as these things go, you have to watch what you say, everything is going swimmingly in Bergen-Belsen until things change for the worse around December 1944. What happens? It's quite simple. The Germans, it is now very clear to them that they are losing the war. So what are they going to do? Well, the answer is they're going to empty all the murder camps, all the killing camps, and most of the labor camps where conditions are horrendous, and send them, all these people who are left in those places, to other camps, the most significant of which for this purpose is Bergen-Belsen. Now, this is December 44, it's midwinter. The way that you get prisoner X from Camp A to Camp B is not by train, but by walking. And that means that December in 44, December and January and February and March, the death marches are coming into Bergen-Belsen, thousands upon thousands of people. And in that context, thousands of people suddenly come into a camp that was built for 10,000, and suddenly the camp houses 40,000 people. That's not the interesting part. The interesting part is that the camp houses 40,000 people without any increase, and I mean any increase, in food, without any increase in drinking water, and most important of all, with no increase in sewage, toilets, and sanitation. And after a number of things start to happen. The first thing is that people have nothing to eat and start going mad, which is what you do when you don't have what to eat. I have a friend who actually lives in Chicago. I don't know if he's in the audience, who was in Bergen-Belsen during that time. And he actually talks about the cannibalism that he witnessed in Bergen-Belsen in those years. When the Canadian and British Army liberated Bergen-Belsen, they had somewhere between 20 and 35,000 bodies to bury. When you walked around Bergen-Belsen in April, beginning of April, the end of March, 1945, what you basically had was an area, I don't know what the Chicago analogy is, but it's something a little smaller than the Boston Commons or Central Park in New York. You have an area that is strewn as far as the eye can see, that is strewn with bodies. And there I am in the midst of this, playing hide and seek with my friends among the bodies. The great, brilliant American critic wrote an amazing book about the camps in those years. And what he talks about is that one of the ways that the Germans killed Jews was through excrement. So let me explain that. You need to understand that with no food, with no sanitation, what grows and multiplies in the scores of thousands is a disease called typhus. Typhus has a number of manifestations. The one I'm talking about is called fleck typhus, which is you have some kind of markings on your belly, scabs or wounds, I don't remember. And you get fevers that go up to 106, 107. But the main area where typhus hits you is that you have no control over your bowels. So picture living in a barracks with a couple hundred people in Bergen-Belsen. There are 6 toilet seats in a semicircle carved into a wooden frame outside, and thousands of people whose insides are exploding, who cannot wait. My father is in one barracks. I'm in another with my mother. We are on a top bunk of the three-tiered bunks with straw and trying mightily not to let our excrement rain down on the people below us, which is next to impossible anyway. You simply cannot make it in time, and even if you do, there is no room for you. And so excremental assault becomes a form of murder. It becomes a form of humiliation, and it is humiliation that is the hallmark of the survivor. And humiliation is something that for the most part, we do not ever get over. In the midst of all of this, the following is going on. I'm going to read some sections from my book because it'll go better and it will be clearer. Where are you? There. Here we go. This is what S.A. told me about his mother in Bergen-Belsen. She is caught taking a piece of bread from the hand of a corpse. In camp law, this constitutes stealing. She is brought to, quotes, trial. The judges and the lawyers are all Jews. Before the war, stars in their profession. The best lawyers in Europe were in that courtroom where this woman, Mrs. A, was being tried. The top Nazis in the camp attend the trial because it's a show. It's for their amusement. The prosecution asks her whether she is aware of her, quotes, crime, and tries to get her to talk about it. Mrs. A is completely silent. The defense asks whether she has anything to say on her own behalf. Perhaps there was some extenuating issue. She is completely silent. The judge warns her that if she says nothing, the law presumes her fully guilty and exacts the severest penalty. What's the severest penalty? 3 days without food in a solitary underground cell. She is completely silent. 3 days later, she emerges from the cell more dead than alive. Her husband, outraged, greets her. How can you have done this? How can you, in your already weak condition, have done this? Don't you know that it's forbidden to place oneself into danger? Why didn't you answer those questions? She responded. The judge, she said, was a Jew. He sat there with his pad and his pencil poised. The lawyers, she continued, were Jews. They sat with their pads, with their pencils poised. It was Shabbos Kodesh. Had I spoken, I would have caused each to write, and thereby to be Mechalel Shabbos. I was not prepared, she said, to do that. I want you to imagine again, you've seen the films of it. The films of the Holocaust that you've seen, Night and Fog and others, are all taken by the British, by the BBC and the British Army of the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. Fields and fields filled with bodies, some naked, some fully dressed, looking as if they're taking a nap, some of them. It brings me again to Tillim Ayin Tes, Psalm 79, a psalm by Asaph. Bo Goyim Elokim, Bo Goyim Benacholasecha, Tumu as Heichal Kodshecha, Samu as Yerushalayim La'iyim, your inheritance. The nations have entered your inheritance. They defiled your holy sanctuary. They turned Yerushalayim into heaps of rubble. They have rendered the corpses of your servants as food for the birds of heaven, the flesh of your pious ones for the beasts of the earth. They spilled their blood like waters around Yerushalayim, and there is no one to bury them. We became the objects of humiliation to our neighbors, ridicule and scorn to those around us. I can think of no better description of the Shoah than the 79th Psalm, except that the 79th Psalm talks about, as dreadful as it was, a tiny demography. And the one I'm talking about is the destruction of 6 million Jews and 1.5 million children. The Germans decide to empty the Star Camp, and that includes me, because Bergen-Belsen is too sickly, there's too much typhus, there's too much death, and there simply isn't any food. There wasn't even food for the guards. 3 trains leave Bergen-Belsen on April 7th, 8th, and 10th, each having 2,500 Jews on it. The first train, each of the trains is headed to Theresienstadt, which had a population similar to Bergen-Belsen, though bigger. The first train is liberated by the Americans near Berlin. The second train, filled with Hungarian Jews, actually makes it to Theresienstadt. And the third train, as far as historians knew, fell off the face of the earth. That is to say, no one knew what happened to that train for many, many years. Well, I was on that train with my mother and my father, both alive, both racked with fever, both mad with illness, but I was on that train. And maybe, just maybe, I have some memories of that train. I am not yet 3. If you think of Bergen-Belsen and Prague, where the Theresienstadt is, you can think of a straight line due south. The train does not go due south because there are no rail lines. They're all bombed out. So it is zigging and zagging and zigging and zagging and trying to make its way south. Somewhere near the Polish border, our train is stopped and liberated by the Russian army. Believe it or not, our saviors on that day were Cossacks. Cossacks came in to the train. The train had been traveling for 13 days. I personally have now several times driven the trip from Bergen-Belsen to Trobitz in 4 hours or less. But the train took 13 days. It was bombed by the Americans and the British. The train had to stop, I would say, every 6-7 hours. And everyone on the train, most of the people, not everyone, most of the people on the train were dead sick from typhus. Many of them literally died and had to be buried. The train had a 18-year-old guy who was a big bruiser of a man, frum, observant, committed, who was the head of the Chevra Kadisha. He is still alive, God bless him. I speak to him regularly. He lives in Eretz Israel, he's on kibbutz. And it is with him that I had to restructure my whole memory of the Holocaust, which was not very accurate. The train finally comes to a halt in this small town called Trobitz. The people of Trobitz had never seen a Jew. No Jew had ever lived in Trobitz. It's a village of 700 on a lovely lake. Today, if you go to Trobitz, there is a Jewish cemetery there. These are all the victims of typhus that were on that train. It's a cemetery of 50, 60 graves, believe it or not, with a kiyor of Natilas Yadayim standing outside. The townspeople take beautiful care of this Beis HaChaim, of this Jewish cemetery. And from time to time, people come and take their dead and move them to Eretz Israel. So the graves are getting fewer. My father was not buried there. That cemetery had not yet been built. My father died within 5 days of reaching Trobitz, and he is buried in the most respectful place that one can imagine the townspeople burying him in. Namely, he's buried in the churchyard right next to the church. And for 50 years, he lay there with a sign at the front of the churchyard. Here lie the graves. There are 2 mass graves there. He's in one of them. And in the churchyard, there was a sign that the Soviets put up for this is East Germany for years and years and years. All it said is, hier ruhen unsere gefallene Brüder. Here lie our fallen brothers, with no reference, of course, to their Jewishness or to anything else. The mayor of the town was hit by typhus. He died, as did many members of the town. And this is what, I guess, the best description of what the Israelis call kever achim, a communal grave where these people are buried. I am very lucky. At some level, I have a grave to go to. Remember that 90% of the Kedoshim went up in smoke, and there is no zecher of them except in our hearts. My father dies in Trobitz. My mother is given a sign pinned to her by the Russian Red Cross saying, about to die. She was very proud of this sign, which she kept for many years afterwards. But in the meantime, I and several other children in Trobitz were taken to Leipzig, which is a nearby city in Germany, and from there sent back to Holland. When I get to Holland, I come to Eindhoven. Eindhoven is the center of Philips Industries in Holland. Philips Industries had a terrific adoption program, and I am quickly adopted by, believe it or not, a Jewish family that survived in Holland. Spring, 1946. I am riding breathlessly on the back of the scooter, my arms wrapped around the broken-in mail jacket in front of me, my head buried deep into it, one eye only, taking in the colors, the sun. He and his wife had adopted me. I remember only his back, no face, no name. Gloriously, we putter through Elysian fields of golden hay and summer greenery. Let this ride never end, I ask. It does. And we arrive at the Catholic hospital in Eindhoven. Gingerly, he helps me down, fearful of my pallor, my fragility. We are in a room. Everything is white. The ceilings are very high. There is a woman in the white bed with the white bars, surrounded by the whole Catholic Church, nuns, priests. There wasn't a lot of room and it was getting hot. Someone signals me to greet her. Hello, madame, I say. The jacket that brought me this far says, she's not madame. She's your mother. After the Holocaust. My mother? My whole being rebels at the word. My body shakes. Somewhere inside, I scream a cry, so grief-struck, so thunderous, that no one is left in the room, save for the woman in the bed. I look at her shattered form, her rheumatic, deformed legs, the Holocaust madness still in her eyes. My mother? Not, I screamed silently, not. The jacket has left. His warmth, his reassurance puttering into a distance not meant for me. Can a child actually want to die after the Holocaust? Joseph, she says, Joseph, yes, I am your mother. He doesn't seem to recognize you, the church says. It is possible that he isn't yours, isn't it? Children get lost, displaced, mix-ups are common. We really cannot let you keep this child unless we are sure he is yours. Whoever he is, you can be sure that the church will take very good care of him. She understands the stakes. She always does. That's how we survive. Joseph, she says, Joseph, come here. There is kindness in the horror of reform. I come. He doesn't recognize me, she says to the church, because the last time he saw me, I weighed 70 pounds less than I do now. Come, sit here, she says to me. We'll play a little. I want no part of her wretched, morbid form. I don't sit. I feel I'll vomit. I don't understand the church. The church leaves. She says to them, there are too many people in this room. How can I reacquaint myself with my child in the middle of a theater? Can you all please leave? So they leave, save for one or two, perhaps the decision makers. She speaks to me with love, gently, gently. Do you remember how we used to read Little Red Riding Hood together? How I would read one line and you would finish the rhyme in the next line? She tries it. I respond haltingly with the rhymes. Soon I cannot control them. They pour out, rhyme after rhyme, verse after verse. Thus did I sing that morning the poetry of Bergen-Belsen, of the corpses I played around, of the typhus feces that were my sandbox. Thus did I sing the song of the hunger and of the fever, of the cold that does not let up, of mother washing my body with her coffee rations. Thus did I sing then on the morrow after the Holocaust, of the rhymes of the angel of death. Thus did my song echo the rattle in father's chest, as he reached up skyward to call out his brothers, long gone in Sobibor, that he too was coming. The church leaves. There is a drawer in the white night table next to the white bed with the white bars. Open it, she says to me. Inside, a small mountain. In the book, I call it a foiled colored chocolates with Hanukkah gelt. Deep in the mountain, I rescue a small pair of tzitzis and a small, exquisite red sitter. What are these? I ask. You are a Jew, she says to me, and Jews need these things. Our first conversation after the Holocaust. We're in the hospital for a few months together, and then we move to a house in The Hague filled with survivors. It used to be an old people's home. Jewish community owned it after the war again and moved the survivors into it. After the Holocaust, in 1946, the Jewish Home for Survivors in The Hague sold its chametz to a Gentile before Pesach, as Jews had been doing for thousands of years. It sold it as if the Holocaust had never taken place. Not a beat was missed, not a hesitation apparent. I have in my possession, upstairs, I'm in the house now, the original certificate of sale. The Jews gathered at the table for this, my first Seder, battered, limping, palsied, unreal, snuffling without joy, barely looking at each other. We sang Dayenu that year. That was the year I learned the melody. They sang Dayenu that year, these Jews who in Westerbork had witnessed the hospital being emptied and its patient put on trains to Auschwitz, thereby putting to bed any illusion that Auschwitz was a labor camp. These self-same Jews who with the arrival of a new train every Tuesday morning heard the death knell toll for them, these Jews sang, if you had taken care of us in the wilderness, Almighty God, and not provided us with the manna, Dayenu, that would have been enough. They sang Dayenu that year. These Jews who had their children snatched, screaming from their hands in Westerbork and tossed onto the train to Sobibor, these self-same Jews who waved to their children as the train pulled out of the camp, a train no one in heaven nor upon the earth saw fit to stop. These Jews sang, if you had given us the manna, Almighty God, and had not given us the holy Sabbath, Dayenu, that would have been enough. They sang Dayenu that year. These Jews who had witnessed the departure of the last train to leave Westerbork for the east, the train filled with the Unbekannte Kinder, the unknown children, the ones whose parents had preceded them on the train trips to the gases and the shootings and the burnings, the children who had forgotten their names, who were inarticulate, who were pre-articulate, who held each other's hands, their eyes frozen in fear, these self-same Jews who screamed and never again slept through the night for having seen those eyes. These Jews sang, if you had given us the holy Sabbath, Almighty God, and had not given us the Torah, Dayenu, that would have been enough. They wept through Dayenu that year after the Holocaust. We are now in the middle of Sfiras HaOmer. For 49 days, we mourn. We mourn for 49 days for Talmidei Rabbi Akiva. Talmidei Rabbi Akiva were punished, the Gemara says. 24,000 of them died. But they were punished. There was a reason for their death. And we mourned them for 49 days. That's the longest mourning period in all of halacha. You could argue 33, you could argue 49, doesn't change the argument. And so I ask you, my friends, for 24,000 young people who died of croup for a cause we mourn for 49 days. Does the Orthodox community mourn like that for 1.5 million children? Not even for 49 days, but not even 5 minutes. When will we take the time to remember Tinokos Shel Beis Rabbim? It's outrageous. Jews in those years did not remain in Holland. For the most part, they left. So did we 4 years later. My mother and I arrived to her mother living in Montreal and her extended family in December of 1948. As soon as we are settled, they hire a Melamed. The Melamed comes and teaches me Aleph Beis. I learned it very quickly. I love the letters, I love the vowels. But one thing happened that I didn't understand its significance until I was older. When you teach a child to read Hebrew, what's the triumphal moment? What comes at the end? Finally, the child is able to read on his own, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. Not me. As soon as I could make out the letters and read with some fluency, the Melamed opens the siddur, and my introduction to Hebrew was Yiskadal v'Yiskadash Shemei Rabbah. Tomorrow morning, you're going to shul, and you have to say Kaddish for your father. I go to shul. I'm 6 years old. I go to shul in the morning. I stand with all the Polish survivors in front of the shul and say Kaddish. I become a champ at saying Kaddish. I say Kaddish for months on end. And not once does anyone ask me who I'm saying Kaddish for. How many kids do you know in shul who say Kaddish? After the Holocaust does not let up. I'm going to end with a few paragraphs here. It's an essay that forms the last chapter of my book called The Last Witness. Imagine it, the end of an era. The last person able to testify to all that transpired, to all that befell us, the last person who could affirm that we indeed saw what we saw is gone. Of all the rememberers, I alone am left to sit here, knowing that my time will also come. And then, what becomes of the tale? I am limited in what I remember. I was not yet 3 when the war ended. What value is there in the few horrible scenes I can conjure? The historical record is not enriched by them. My memory has become a datum, a relic, valid but inessential. While they still lived, I stood among the other survivors, seasoned, wizened men and women who were perpetually old, prematurely gaunt. Their bodies reflected those days. The deep shadows of what they had once taken in never left them. They would glance at me in passing, surveying my inconsequentiality, often with patience, often without. I was a fly. Do you really know, child? They would ask. Do you really know what it is to have your parents shot before your eyes? Do you really know what it is to have your grandparents thrown out of the upstairs window during a liquidation? Did I know? I would put my hands in my pocket and shrug, looking in those early days for a cigarette. Did I know? The question was an accusation. You do not understand, they were saying. You were too young to make sense of it. The carnage and death, the murder by fever and by hunger, all of which I witnessed, some of which I experienced, were not valid to them because I could not have made sense of such experiences as they occurred. My testimony was that of a blind man. I heard the noises, put it all together later, not acceptable in a court of law, not sufficiently real. You say they were there, they argued, but you really weren't. Then they would appear astonished at the pain that came over my face from such invalidation and would hastily take pity. This gewena Jingele, they would say, it's not your fault, you were just a kid. Children, they meant, are frivolous. Let's not take their experiences seriously. They are all gone now. Their hoary heads and Polish teeth have crossed the great divide, and I alone am left to tell the tale. I'm a bit of a fake, don't you think? A bit of a liar, no? When those memories I did possess would beckon, I trembled. Sleepless nights would become my lot, filled with chills and despair. They were without solace, without consolation. I would not allow love. Love promised what little memory I did have would be submerged. Love meant the cesspool that was Bergen-Belsen would disappear. When I was 10 years old, my father murdered, my mother married a man in Montreal who forbade mention of the Holocaust. Shall we let it disappear, I wondered? And if we did, would I continue being? I lived with him, but did not take up with him. I could not remember what brought on my nocturnal fits of madness. There were no visual scenes in my imagination when primordial terrors racked my body. I could not remember why I would periodically get mammoth rheumatic tremors that seized me in the darkness and in the light. I did not remember why mother's moans of terror shuddered within me decades after she died. I knew that I was afraid of her, not for what she had been, but for what she had become. I knew that I did not want to have the toughness in her that allowed her to survive. Yet did it enter me, yet does it overtake me. It turns people away when they sense it. I am not easy to love. For all that, I did not visit my past, really never gave it a glance until I turned 50. Slowly, I stared at it. Slowly, with index cards, I put it in chronological order. The Hague, Westerbork, Bergen-Belsen, The Hague. Soon after the end of the Holocaust in Montreal, I fell in with other child survivors. They made up fully a third of my 7th grade class. We were silent about our past. When the topic came up, we would become restless and look about anxiously for distraction. We did not want to be witnesses. We just wanted to be like everybody else. Eventually, we each became an anti-witness. We didn't want to hear about it, talk about it. We pretended that the ordeal happened to others, to those who did have numbers on their arms. Perhaps we understood that the mature survivors constituted the most humiliated group of people on earth. and we wanted no part of their residual shame. Mother died when I turned 40. Freddie, a tad older than I, came to sit with me at her shiva. Do you remember, Joseph, he said, do you remember how we used to play hide and seek around the corpses in Bergen-Belsen? I did not remember, but it was this question coming from him that allowed me to accept myself as a survivor. And it has taken nearly 3 decades following that shiva for me to have learned that what my mind does not remember, my body does, and so does my soul. Hesitantly, I take my place among the survivors. I get into the line at the gates of the death camps, and I am there more in death than in life. And so I sometimes entertain this fantasy that because of my sheer youth during those years, I am the last witness. The Holocaust will pass out of experience and into history. There will be no one left to say, and then they took my parents away and I never saw them again. Or Moshele died in my arms, he had not eaten anything in 2 weeks, and his 9-year-old friend could not take it anymore. Or my high school teacher examined all the boys in the class, and all the circumcised ones were expelled. I carry this fear that when I disappear, so will the last memories of that great darkness. So will the fecal stench that attended the typhus. So will the ravages of the outdoors that attended the roll calls and the stiffness everywhere of the corpses. And in the absence of such primary memories, how long will it take for a civilized country again to allow a leader into office who harbors evil beliefs and insidious desires? And how long until the physicians and lawyers and judges and philosophers and writers and musicians and composers and conductors join his cause? I wonder if I indeed turn out to be the last witness, will my death mark the beginning of the great forgetting? At such moments, fortunately, I have also come to realize the arrogance of such questions and to understand that such arrogance is where idolatry and atheism begin. For I will not be the last witness. The last witness, the greatest, the most humiliated witness of all. I speak, of course, of God himself. He who is everywhere had to have been there too. He had to have been present, and he had to have witnessed his reputation as Redeemer and Savior of Israel sink into the mud of Treblinka and Belzec. What will the Egyptians say? Moses asked when God threatens to destroy Israel after they worship the golden calf. Do you want them to say that you took the Jews out of Egypt only so that you might destroy them yourself when they reach the desert? The argument worked. He was averse to being misconstrued. There is a scene in the great role HaShoah played the deputy, in which a priest asks the character that HaShoah based on Joseph Mengele, something along the lines of, have you no fear of divine retribution? Do you not believe that God will call you to account for this? And Mengele is made to answer, you have no idea how I wish with all my heart that he strike me down, that he slay me every time I send a child to the gas. But he doesn't. No one came out of the Holocaust looking worse than God. He is compassionate, the theologians used to say. He hates evil, they claimed. Omnipotent, they said, caring for his chosen people. Not this time. Not 6 million times. Yet although he did not save 6 million of his people, in an extraordinary reversal of roles and of history, his people, the ones who survived, saved him. The rabbis who escaped the inferno spent scant time contemplating, much less bemoaning what the philosopher Martin Buber has called the eclipse of God. The Rebbe of Tzanz, Kloisenberg, who came out of the camps shaven and shrunk, raged for years about his Holocaust experience, yet skipped nary a beat in his loving worship of his creator and embarked almost at once on a successful campaign to build a hospital. The rabbis of Bobov, Ungvar, and Satmar created housing for the poor and provided food programs for the infirm, like the rabbi of Muzhitz, another survivor, who composed and sang his way through the 1950s and 60s. They built houses of worship, ritual baths, and educational institutions in numbers unmatched ever in Jewish history. The mighty theological questions emerging from the muddy darkness they found merely led back to the gates of Auschwitz, and they chose not to go there. Never would they be humiliated again, and never again would they permit God such humiliation. And they had confidence that he who commands the dawn to follow the night will represent them fairly when the last witness is gone, that he himself will report on the heroism of the victims, on how in their last moment they sanctified his name. The last witness will join the legions of victims in the celestial palace that is touted as the place where Elijah, in God's presence, will provide the mighty answers, including one that deals with the great absence while 1.5 million Jewish children were murdered. 2 lines will form in heaven, each of them silent. No one will be asking Elijah a thing. The first line, with Dostoevsky as its guide, might say, Elijah, tell God that we really have no interest in post facto explanations about his great absence. It's just too late for explanations. Too much injustice, too much cruelty has been allowed to happen. The notion of an adequate answer to such horror is itself repulsive. The second line, forming the dialectic, would have Avraham Avinu as its guide. It might assert, it was never about us, Elijah. We never sought and still don't need explanations. It was always about God. We just couldn't bear his vast humiliation, and we did what we could to mitigate it. Blessed be his name forever and ever. And were I the last witness, I would rage against both camps and ask, how dare they remain silent? What self-absorbed luxury were they indulging in anyway, when the memory of that time, of those children, is in danger of dissipating? Where is God? I would thunder at Elijah. Is he out there reciting the names of the camps? Belsen, Treblinka, Majdanek, Sobibor? Is he reading the names of the victims? I would pound the tables with both hands. Is he weeping? Thank you very much. I have all the answers. Any questions you want to ask, feel free.
If anyone has any questions, they could please type them into the chat room. We'll pose them to Rabbi Polak. On behalf of the shul, I want to thank him again for a brilliant presentation, heart-wrenching one, but a brilliant presentation. We'll give people a chance, if there are any questions, again, to type them into the chat room, and we'll conclude in a few moments with the Kel Mole, as we do every year. Rabbi, I think your presentation said it all, and people are still taking it in. So, with everyone's permission, as we do every year to conclude this, I will conclude it with the Kelmale. El male rachamim shochen b'mromim hamitzahem menucha nechona al kanfei hashchina b'ma'alot kedoshim u'tohorim kizor harakia mazirim את כל הנשמות של 6,000,000 היהודים חללי השואה שנהרגו, שנשחטו, שנשרפו ושנספו על קידוש השם בידי המרצחים הגרמנים ועוזריהם משאר העמים. לכהנה בעל הרחמים יסתירם בסתר כנפיו לעולמים ויצרור בצרור החיים את נשמותיהם. אדוני הוא נחלתם, בגן עדן תהא מנוחתם, ויעמדו לגורלם לקץ הימין, ונאמר אמן.
Amen.
For those who are interested, Rabbi Polak's book is available on Amazon and in other sources as well. Again, Rabbi Polak, thank you so very much for this evening. We look forward to being able to meet you for a simcha on a happy occasion.
Amen.
And thank everyone for participating. Once again, I thank Devorah Sorsher, who has been the driving force behind this presentation every year, Lev Cates for his introduction, and Randy Cohn for helping me as well on this. Thank you all. Have a very meaningful evening and a good night. Bye-bye.